A very good Friday afternoon to each and every one of you. Thank you for joining us today as we continue our walk through history, as we continue examining the story of God as revealed to us within His Word. We are concluding today our study of the saga of Gideon as is found in Judges chapters 6, 7, and 8. We have concluded the first half of Gideon's story, which encompasses chapter 6 and the majority of chapter 7. Things are ending on a pretty high note as the deliverance of Israel has been completed for the most part at the hands of Gideon. He has been chosen as this judge, this savior, this warrior for the Israelite people, delivering them from the hands of their oppressors and the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the Kedemites. And yet what we're going to see here in chapter 7, verse 20 through 24 through the end of chapter 8 is that Gideon's story doesn't really end so well. We're going to examine his problems today, see where things kind of went off the rails and what we can learn from that. Joining me as always is my good friend Alan Seenestrang. Alan, it is good to be with you today. I hope you're excited to finish out this story of Gideon. It has been, well, it's been a story. It's definitely been a story, and hopefully this will benefit everyone who's joining in with us today as we close out this story together.
Yeah, hopefully. Well, it's a story that unfortunately it's not a great story to end up with, which is it's just so sad. It really highlights in the Bible. I mean, you kind of want some of these to be heroes. I mean, they're in the Bible. You've heard names like Gideon and Othniel and all these guys for your entire life, and it's actually a little more disappointing as you grow older because they're in higher standing when you're younger and you're just reading about these in VBS, and then when you actually dive in, you're like, oh, these aren't the best guys. These are not quite the heroes you expected. Even the Abrahams and the Davids and the real big names that are still considered pretty good have some pretty major flaws. So it's a little disappointing, but I mean, the whole point of that is just to highlight the perfection and the greatness that is Christ, and point to the true hero of the story here in the Bible.
Yeah, that's a really good point you're making, and it's something that we mentioned earlier on in these studies. Is that I think often whenever we teach the judges' stories, especially in our younger classes, we do tend to G-rate them. We take out a lot of the worst portions. We don't emphasize really the shortcomings of the judges, except maybe Samson. We just, most of what we say is he was a womanizer, and that's mostly what we go with. But there were faults with the vast majority of these judges, and as you can see on the screen, which is an illustration of the judge's story in this downward spiral, as Philip Martin calls it, the fatal funnel of judges. You see things just growing worse and worse. We see the judges and their character and their stories break down and become worse and worse as the story progresses. That the prologue that begins on somewhat of a high note really ends in a horrible place in the epilogue. And really, the story of Gideon itself is a microcosm of the entire Judges story as a whole. As you can see on the right side of the screen, this visual from Kenneth Way's Judges and Ruth commentary that's in the Teach the Text commentary series. We see how the two halves of Gideon's story, the first half being chapter 6 and chapter 7, it lines up pretty well with the prologue of how things begin rolling in Judges. That there are some high points, there are some low points, but from those things seem to be going well. But then once we get to the second half of Gideon's story, we're backing up a little bit to chapter 7 and verse 24, where Ephraim gets into the mix here. Really, from this point on, things just break down completely. Gideon absolutely in many ways just loses his mind in the way he behaves. Again, just to put it lightly, really I think makes a fool of himself in many ways, and we're going to see how that is the case today. But it all comes back to what we've seen already, the emphasis that we have seen in Judges 6 and 7, the number of times that the text has emphasized to us the Lord's participation in what is taking place, that the Lord was the one who is bringing about the victories, For as much as it is seen as he is present in 6 and 7, he is really absent in the end of chapter 7 and throughout the majority of chapter 8. And we're going to see really a reversal of the good that Gideon himself has done, and how that turns into really bad decision making and bad leadership, bad action that hurts the people in the end. That's what we're going to be looking at today. Hope that you have a Bible and you'll join us as we get into this text. Alan will have the text up here on the screen in just a second. We're going to pick up in chapter 7 and verse 24. Judges chapter 7 and verse 24. We're going to be reading from the Christian Standard Bible, where it tells us that Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim with this message: come down and intercept the Midianites and take control of the watercourses ahead of them as far as Beth Barah and the Jordan. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they took control of the watercourses as far as Beth Barah and the Jordan. They captured Oreb and Zeeb, the two princes of Midian, and they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeeb at the winepress of Zeeb. While they were pursuing the Midianites, they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeeb to Gideon across the Jordan. And the men of Ephraim said to him, why have you done this to us, not calling us when you went to fight against the Midianites? And they argued with him violently. So he said to them, what have I done now compared to you? Is not the gleaning of Ephraim better than the grape harvest of Abiezer? God handed over to you Oreb and Zeeb, the two princes of Midian. What was I able to do compared to you? When he said this, their anger against him subsided. And I think we see some strange behavior maybe on the part of Ephraim, especially considering maybe how hard it was to get people to join Gideon to begin with. And now we have this particular group of God's people, a very strong group of God's people who are thinking, hey, why didn't you call us to begin with? But then we see kind of the evolution of Gideon and sort of his cunning, how he's going to use what has transpired to his benefit here in this case. What do you think about this episode that takes place with Ephraim? Because you're thinking at the end of towards the end of chapter 7, where they have everyone on the run, that things are going to end on a very high note. Things are going to finish out in a good way. And yet here we have really a powder keg where Ephraim's upset. They're arguing with Gideon very violently. How is this going to turn? What do you think about the situation Gideon finds himself in, and how he figures out a way to lower the temperature a little bit to keep from things really going sour at this moment?
The phrase in verse 2 is really what helps Ephraim calm down. And if you think about it, it takes a second to kind of figure out what he's saying. But basically, the grapes of Ephraim, are they not better than the grape harvest of Abiezer? Which, if you go back, that was Gideon's hometown or home area. So he's kind of saying, hey, you guys did something even greater than we did. My guys, defeated them, but you guys captured the two princes of Midian.
Mm-hmm.
So he's buttering them up. He's definitely he's not a newbie to politics here, I guess, at this point. So he knows how to appease their sense of mission and what they've done, and obviously it works. Their anger subsided against him. But it's interesting that Gideon sent these messengers out. Ephraim was called. They actually kill the kings and then bring their heads to Gideon. Well, what's the point of that? If it's just kind of why are they why are they even worried about Gideon? You're like, yeah, Gideon led this army and defeated them, but what do they have to do with Gideon? Why would they bring their heads to Gideon? Well, this is, again, you're starting to see this kind of language pointing toward the point where they actually ask Gideon to be king over Israel. Mm-hmm. So you're starting to see it's almost like a little bit of maybe tribute kind of a thing happening here. Just it is a little, this early part is a little strange, but it tends to make a little more sense in the full context later on.
Yeah, I think what we see here is the issue of status really
Hmm.
coming to the surface of the story of Gideon. If we go back to chapter 6 and from our study on Tuesday, remember that whenever they were getting ready to blow their trumpets out all around the camp, that they were to shout, the 300 that were with Gideon, that were divided into the three companies, they were to shout for the Lord and for Gideon. Here Gideon is saying, well, we're gonna say that we're doing this for the Lord's sake, but we're also going to do this for Gideon's sake. And we compare that to ancient accounts of the same thing being done, and how this was to show that we're going to give tribute to not only the deity but also to the royal person, the person who serves in that royal type of position. And here we have this status being fought over here, to an extent. Here come the men of Ephraim showing, look, this is what we have done. We've really finished off this whole issue. We've put an end to it. And they're saying, you should have called us to begin with, and maybe we could have done even more. And instead of Gideon making a huge deal out of this, he's going to give them the status right here. At this moment, he's going to concede status to say, hey, you've done this great thing. You're gleaning of the grape harvest, which is you've gone through, and what you have left after the great harvest of the grapes, well, that's even more than our entire harvest of grapes in the house of Abiezar. That what you have done, what you have left for the poor, is more than what we have taken for ourselves. He allows that status to be present here, but it doesn't take very long within the story before Gideon wants to take hold of that status himself and position himself as a person of influence and as a person of power within the nation of Israel. We see that beginning in verse number 4 of Judges chapter 8, that Gideon and 300 men came to the Jordan and crossed it. They were exhausted, but still in pursuit. And he said to the men of Succoth, please give us loaves of bread to the troops under my command, because they are exhausted, for I am pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian. But the princes of Succoth said, are Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hands, that we should give bread to your army? Gideon replied, very well. When the Lord has handed Zebah and Zalmunna over to me, I will tear your flesh with thorns and briars from the wilderness. He went from there to Penuel and asked the same thing from them. And the men of Penuel answered just as the men of Succoth had answered. He also told the men of Penuel, when I return safely, I will tear down this tower. Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and with them their army of about 15,000 men, who were all those left of the entire army of the Kedemites. Those who had been killed were 120,000 armed men. Gideon traveled on the caravan route east of Nobah and Jogbehah and attacked their army while the army felt secure. And Zebah and Zalmunna fled, and he pursued them and captured the two kings of Midian and routed the army. Gideon, son of Joash, returned from the battle by the ascent of Heres, and he captured a youth from the men of Succoth and interrogated him. And the youth wrote down for him the names of the 77 elders, or 77 leaders and elders of Succoth. And then he went to the men of Succoth and said, here are Zebah and Zalmunna. You taunted me about them, saying, are Zebah and Zalmunna now in your power, that we should give bread to your exhausted men? So he took the elders of the city. He took some thorns and briars from the wilderness, and he disciplined the men of Succoth with them. He also tore down the tower of Penuel and killed the men of the city. He asked Zebah and Zalmunna, what kind of men did you kill at Tabor? And they were like you, they said. Each resembled, notice this, the son of a king. So he said, they were my brothers and the sons of my mother. As the Lord lives, if you had let them live, I would not kill you. And then he said to Jether, his firstborn, get up and kill them. But the youth did not draw his sword, for he was afraid. We've heard that before, because he was still a youth. Zebah and Zalmunna said, get up and strike us down yourself, for a man is judged by his strength. So Gideon got up, killed Zebah and Zalmunna, and took the crescent ornaments that were on their necks of their camels. We really seen at this point Gideon turn into someone that we probably did not expect at all to be present within this story. He goes from being this hesitant coward, lacking confidence, lacking courage, to being a man who definitely has much more courage, but also turns, I mean, just honestly, into a very ruthless man. Alan, what do you see here within this text that shows you that this great transition within the character of Gideon that's pointing us really in a really bad direction as far as who he's becoming as this judge, savior, and warrior of God's people at this time?
Well, it kind of helps to know your geography, I think, a little bit. You know, uh, they're fighting on the eastern side of the Jordan, so that would have been, you know, in the area where the three tribes, you know, remained: Reuben and Manasseh and Gad, and then the rest of the, you know, everyone else went across the Jordan. Way back in the book of Joshua, they took Jericho and conquered the land, and then those three tribes went back across the Jordan. Well, that's what we're talking about here. So, so way back here at the end of end of chapter 7, when he's calling for Ephraim, he's actually calling for, you know, the tribes on the other side of the Jordan, and to come down to the Jordan, and, you know, capture the waters against them, basically kind of cut them off. And in verse 24, because they were fleeing toward the Jordan back into, you know, the main part of Israel. So if they can cut off the waters there, then they're basically captured. And Gideon's coming after them from one direction. Gideon's heading west, and here come the Ephraimites heading east, and they can, you know, capture them at the Jordan. Well, Ephraim does come out. They capture the waters, and they capture the two princes, but they didn't really kind of finish the job. So they brought these two princes to him, Oreb and Zeb, and then they and then Ephraim has the gall to kind of, you know, get mad at Gideon just for beating the Midianites, and I guess they were jealous because they didn't get a bigger piece of the cake anyway. And but then you see in verse 4, and Gideon came to the Jordan and crossed over, he and the 300 men who were with him, because they were still pursuing the kings. And later on, we see that there was still about 15,000 men down in verse 10 that those two kings of Midian still had. Now, that was a definitely well diminished army from 120,000 down to
Right, right.
15. But, you know, why didn't, you know, if Ephraim was doing their job, why didn't they capture, why didn't they stop them from going through their land? And I think that's why you start to see a change in how Gideon deals with these cities, because now I think we're in the territory of Ephraim. Now we've crossed over the Jordan, we're in the territory of Ephraim, and he comes to these two cities. First it's Succoth, and then to Penuel, and, you know, he's simply asking for, you know, some bread for his wearied army, and they refuse, both of them. And now you start to see, I think, Gideon's anger. You know, before he kind of dealt shrewdly with them. They were angry, he kind of calmed them down, you know, whatever, you can deal with that. But now, you know, that they're not really, you know, they've dropped the ball, they've let this army, you know, get away, the two kings, when they could have just wiped them out. um, in these two cities at this point. I mean, there's no reason why they should refuse to help him, because he's clearly winning the war, and Midian is, you know, close to defeat. And yet they still, until, you know, have you gotten Zeba and Zalmunna into their hand? No, he hasn't captured them yet. So until that happens, they're not pledging their allegiance, or, you know, they're not casting their lot or their sword with Gideon. And, you know, and before, you know, Gideon seemed okay with it, but now he's, you know, he feels, I think he's starting to feel a little more powerful and feel like he can, um, exact a little revenge, which he does. I remember these things that he does to them after he defeats those two kings of Midian. He goes back to the men of Succoth and to the city of Penuel, and, I mean, kills them. I mean, these are fellow Israelites we're
That's right.
talking about
Hmm.
here. and he kills the men of the city in Penuel, and he whips the elders of the city of Succoth with thorns to teach them a lesson. I mean, what right does Gideon have to do that? Even if they did refuse to help him, what authority, what right does he have to, especially kill fellow Israelites?
Mhm.
I mean, this is it's just crazy. All of a sudden, we haven't seen this amongst the Israelites in a long time. Um, Although, if you kind of consider, there is a little history between the two sides of the Jordan.
Mhm.
If you remember, when the tribes, after God had given them rest and they'd captured all the land, and the people send those three tribes back across the Jordan. You remember that story kind of right at the end of Joshua,
Joshua
where they
22.
built this altar,
Mhm.
and then the western tribes thought that they were, this was a altar of apostasy, and so they start to go to war against them, and then it turned out to be a misunderstanding. There was just it was supposed to be an altar to remember, so there wasn't this separation. Well, uh, I I think that that was a great idea back then, but I think that failed, because you see, I mean, Gideon, the Ephraimites getting mad at Gideon and the people of Manasseh and his allies there on that side of the Jordan, and now Gideon coming back and seeking revenge on these Ephraimite cities. There's still clearly some bad blood between East and West here, that that underscores, they had a common enemy in Midian. Well, now that's kind of gone aside, now you start to see some butting of heads between these tribe groups here, and really, actually, we'll see that a lot more in over the last half of the book, starting to see some inner tribal struggles between Israelites against Israelites, not just Israelite against Philistine or Midianite or whoever it is. So you'll see the beginning of that here, and the culmination will come toward the end of the book, when the tribe of Benjamin is almost completely wiped out in a civil war. So we're starting to see the seeds of that getting started right here.
Yeah, adding another layer to what we've seen already with Ephraim, here is, if we think about it from Gideon's perspective, here he is, having been involved in this entire process all the way up to this point. He is the one who has led Israel's army against Midian and their oppressors. He was the one that had them on the run, and here swoops in Ephraim out of nowhere and is able to take out the two princes, Oreb and Zeeb. And they come to Gideon, and you might almost wonder, they're thinking, you know, why haven't you called us so that we could be involved in this more, to do this already? And then here's Gideon seeing that they've just arrived on the scene. They're late to the party, and here they have this kind of trophy, showing that they've done something, even though they haven't been there very long. If we tie that in with Gideon's possible feelings of, hey, I was the one doing this. I should be the one to have taken out these princes of Midian. If we trace that back to what he said for the Lord and for Gideon, here is this beginning of Gideon wanting to have some status, wanting to be seen as the guy who did all of these things. He was the one who was involved. He was the one who had the success. He was the one that could receive praise. Here are these Ephraimites coming in. They kind of undercut him, took some of that pride. Well, what does he do? He turns around and he takes that out on other people. And it's not that he just takes it out on non-Israelites, but as you mentioned, he takes this out on fellow Israelites. He brings absolute shame upon the men of Succoth in the fact that he whipped them. He spanked them with thorns, basically. And then even worse, he kills and takes the life of the men of Penuel, which is, if we go back and remember the visual from Kenneth Way, where it shows this connecting with the epilogue. Well, what happens at the end of the story of the Judges? Well, at the end of the story of the Judges, it is Israelite on Israelite war. As you mentioned, a tribe is almost completely taken out. And yet through all this, we continue to see an evolution of sorts in Gideon, in the fact that he began as this cowardly, hesitant person who did not want to take the lead. And now that he has experienced some success at the hands of the Lord, he begins to think a little bit too highly of himself, I think.
Mhm.
Go and look at what these men, Zeba and Zamuna, said of Gideon whenever he asked, what kind of men did you kill at Tabor? They said, like you. They were like you. Each resembled the son of a king. Here is this royal type of kingship idea now overtly introduced. I think we see it back in chapter 6 with that battle cry for the Lord and for Gideon. If we do a little digging there, I think we see a little bit of a royal idea in that. And now we see it overtly. Well, what does he do? What does Gideon do? Well, he's going to let his son take charge, Jether, and let him be the one to kill these men. But like father, like son, he's hesitant, he's scared. And Zeba and Zamuna, they taunt him. They say, listen, if you're really somebody, you're going to kill us yourself. He does that. And what does he take after that? He took the crescent ornaments that were on the necks of their camels. He now not only has maybe exuded the idea that he has some sort of royal status, but now he's almost becoming a Midianite type of king. He's now dressing like a king. He has these ornaments that if he put those ornaments on himself or on his own livestock or his own camels that he might have ridden, there's nothing that would differentiate him between this pagan nation. And we're really seeing getting here in this moment. We're seeing this evolution of going from, we're seeing the full arc, really. He begins as a cowardly, a hesitant person. He kind of rises to a moment of faith whenever he hears the dream and he says, the Lord is going to give this over to us. But then he starts going downhill whenever he says, not just for the Lord, but for Gideon too. And oh man, I wish I would have gotten those guys that the Ephraimites get. And you know what? I'm really mad for what they did. So I'm going to take it out on my own countrymen. And oh, you think I'm nobody? Watch, I'm going to kill you. And he kills Zeba and Zamuna and he takes everything. He's really making this strong transformation into somebody he was not at all the beginning, and really somebody that he was never intended to be from the beginning, which was a person of royal status, seeing himself in that way. That certainly was not what God desired. You got anything else here, Alan, before we finish out this text with the final reading?
Yeah, you get a really interesting little character tidbit here in verse 18. Um, when he captures those two Midianite kings, he interrogates them about the men they killed at Tabor. Well, we don't know. There's no mention of Tabor. We don't know what this story is, but just reading what Gideon says, they say, okay, we killed these guys. They resembled, they looked like you, the son of a king, and Gideon says they were my brothers, the sons of my mother. So you get an event, kind of a secondhand event in Gideon's life that I think when you go back and read the rest of the story adds some depth to the story, because it talks about Gideon being the youngest of his father's house, and well, seems like a lot of his older brothers were killed in this event. So, he was one of the last surviving ones in his house. So, did that influence how his father acted when Gideon, destroyed the altar of Baal in his town and they wanted to kill him? Well, if he was the last of his many sons, no wonder that father kind of defended him in that way, and it's no wonder Gideon's reactions to God when he comes and says, "Oh, mighty valiant warrior," and you will deliver Israel, and he kind of says, "Where have you been?" He's had some. Not only has he been under the yoke of Midian, he's lost his family members because of that to this point. So it really adds some depth to the character of Gideon, and kind of gives us some in between the lines of why he does what he does a lot of times throughout this story. And then, like you mentioned, we're going to continue to see this rise in Gideon of his own sense of status, to the point where they're going to ask him to become king here coming up.
Yeah, if this mention of Tabor is Mount Tabor, then we're talking about an area within uh 5 to 7 miles of Gideon's hometown of Ophrah. And that's within the tribe of the land of Issachar. Uh, Ophrah is south and a little east of the Sea of Galilee, and Mount Tabor is a little northwest, or I guess southwest of the Sea of Galilee, and then Mount Tabor would be northwest of Ophrah. Maybe that's the area that he's talking about, and he's seen very close, very uphand, close and personal, the destruction that the Midianites had brought upon the people, and part of this is revenge. That Gideon seems to be wanting to get revenge for what they have done. And for everything that Gideon has done up until this point, after the Israelites are seeing everything that he's done, what he has accomplished, the Israelites said to him in verse 22 of Judges chapter 8, rule over us, you as well as your sons and your grandsons, for you delivered us from the power of Midian. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Then he said to them, let me make a request of you. Everyone give me an earring from his plunder. Now the enemy had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they said, we agreed to give them to you. So they spread out a cloak, and everyone threw an earring from his plunder on it. The weight of the gold earrings he requested was 43 pounds of gold, in addition to the crescent ornaments and the ear pendants and the purple garments on the kings of Midian, and the chains on the necks of their camels. Gideon made an ephod from all this and put it in Ophrah, his hometown. And then all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his household. So Midian was subdued before the Israelites, and they were no longer a threat. The land had peace for 40 years during the days of Gideon. And Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, son of Joash, went back to live at his house. And Gideon had 70 sons, his own offspring, since he had many wives. His concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech. Then Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezerites. And then Gideon died, or when Gideon died, the Israelites turned and prostituted themselves by worshiping the Baals, and made Baal Berith their god. And the Israelites did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hand of the enemies around them. They did not show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, for all the good he had done for Israel. This really completes the cycle, Alan, and unfortunately, mixed in with the years of peace is continued unfaithfulness on behalf of Israel. And it all starts in a kind of a strange place. They ask Gideon, will you rule over us? They're already seeing him. I believe not only is Gideon seeing himself in a royal type of role, but the people themselves are seeing Gideon in a royal type of role. They're seeing him as this person who could be their leader. And I wonder if Gideon's response here maybe is a little bit tongue in cheek. He's saying, I'm not going to rule over you. My son's not going to rule over you. God's going to rule over you. Oh, by the way, hey, why don't we take those earrings? Why don't we take that gold? Why don't we take that jewelry? Why don't we do something with that? And of course, what he did with all that was make an ephod from this, and he put it in Ophrah, his hometown. And he goes from being this man who was tearing down idols in his backyard back in chapter 6, and now he is erecting an idol of sorts, something that could be used to manipulate God in some sense, because it was a garment. A normal ephod would be a garment that high priests would wear. But it's just sad to see this being the end of Gideon's life. Him putting himself in a position to be seen without it being overtly said as a king of Israel. He certainly positions himself to fill that role, at least from our perspective, reading him in the history that is recorded for us here in Judges. What do you make of this last portion of Gideon's story here in chapter 8, Alan?
Verse 23 on the surface might seem like it sounds great. It doesn't really match with the rest of the story, because Gideon, they ask Gideon to be the ruler over them. He says, no, I'm not going to be your king. The Lord will rule over you. But then the very next thing he does is make this ephod. Well, think of this in this. I mean, this is supposed to be, I think, a parallel story to the Israelites and the golden calf in Exodus 32. They
That's
ask
the only
Aaron,
other time we see this word for earrings mentioned is in Exodus 32 with the golden calf. The only other time.
Now, when they made that golden calf, they were not worshiping Baal. They were not worshiping Asheroth. They were creating this thing that was supposed to be a representative of God, the same God that they were worshiping. But it was an idol. It was a carven image. They were told not to do that. And then, of course, the Israelites back then, they were, um, they worshipped it in the way that all the other nations worship their gods.
Mhm.
So even though they weren't, bowing down and saying, "Oh, praise Baal" or whatever, they didn't have a different name for it. They thought they were still worshiping God, but they were doing it. They were worshiping God in wicked ways, like the other nations worship their gods.
Mhm.
Well, the same thing's happening here. I mean, this is not an idol to Baal. They're not Baal worshiping here. They're worshiping God, but in this form of this ephod,
Mhm.
and tying that to verse 23, the Lord will rule over you. Well, I think that's Gideon's idea is here. Let's make this ephod, and he is creating a visual representation
Mhm.
of the Lord. And again, that doesn't put, that to Gideon, that equates Gideon with God, because he's creating this God like visual. So just as earlier on when he told his people to say for the Lord and for Gideon, he's not saying I'm greater than God, but he is saying I'm up there next to him. Because the Lord will rule over you, but here I'm making you the Lord is
Right here,
is what's
here I
happening.
am giving you access to him. Look at this important position that I mean. He's not only taking this position kind of royalty, but also kind of being a priest in a sense, taking a position that's not one that belongs to him. It's interesting here, Alan, that it says they became a snare to Gideon and his household. That word snare reminds me of what's said in Judges chapter 2 and verse number 3, where the Lord says, I will not drive out these people before you. There will be thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a trap for you. Just how far has Israel fallen from that point? No longer do they even have to worry about the traps of the people of Canaan. Now they're having to worry about their own decision making becoming a snare and a trap for them. This issue here was not a result of something that the Canaanites had done, not a result of the pagans. This was of Israel's own creation. They had created this roadblock for themselves. But it's not only this idolatry, this paganism that's a problem here, Alan. But what do you think about this language that we see concerning Gideon following verse 28? Concerning his sons, wives, maybe even the name of his son. I think it might give us a little insight into what Gideon really thought of himself.
Hmm. Uh, so verse 30, Gideon had 70 sons, for he had many wives. That's our first clue. Who uh, obviously throughout the Bible we see people with multiple wives and many sons, but those people are normally either very wealthy or they are kings, rulers.
Mm-hmm.
That's especially 70 sons, that many wives. You, that just really didn't happen unless you were a king. The kings had big harems, dozens of wives. Of course, Solomon, is the epitome of all that, 1,000 wives and who knows how many kids. So basically, this is an action of someone who is acting in the role of king, even though he might not give himself that title. He is over Israel in that sense, I think, and he is acting in that way. Um, and then just in verse 31, why else would this son be mentioned? Of course, Abimelech is going to, take some roles here and take place in the next chapter. But even that name gives us a little clue into Gideon's mindset. Abimelech means my father is king. So you're not the king, you refuse to be king, but you name your son my dad is king.
Yep.
So
There's a
obviously
lot of there's
there's
a lot of conflicting. There's a strong conflict here between what Gideon says in verse 23 and what he does in the entirety of the rest of the
mhm.
chapter. He's saying one thing, but his actions are kind of showing that I didn't quite mean. Again, tongue in cheek. I will not rule over you, but God will rule over you. Okay, wink, wink, bunny ears. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
And
But I'm gonna do something completely different.
And what does the Bible say? You shall know them by their fruits.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
don't go by what they say, go by what they do. So what he's doing is acting in the role of king, even though he says he wasn't going to do that. Now the people still had rest, and God gave him victory and peace over Midian. But verse 33 kind of shows how, like you mentioned, usually they would, at least in the past, there in that cycle, it said they would serve God all the days of Othniel or all the days of Ehud or for however many years. Well, um,
Not so here.
what were they doing all the days of Gideon? They had this
Mhm.
ephod snare, false god, and then as soon as he's dead, the people turned and whored after the Baals and made
Right.
bear. And now they're truly worshiping, not even worshiping God in the wrong way, an idol. They're worshiping a completely different God by a
Mhm.
completely different name. They do not even remember the Lord their God in verse 34, who was the one that delivered them, and they did not show love for the family of Jerubbaal in return for all the good that he had done. So that's kind of interesting too. Obviously, they forgot the Lord, which is bad, but why would they forget Gideon so quickly if he was, this great, wonderful ruler or wonderful leader and perfect example? Well, I think he was, um, maybe not the best. He delivered. He got rid of Midian. Props to him, but from that point on, maybe not the best even for Israel for
Mhm.
the rest of his life, because he was pretending to be king half the time.
Right. It's not just that he has these many wives, but he also takes this concubine from Shechem. He intermarries, it seems, with the Canaanite pagan people, and that, as you mentioned, is going to lead into chapter 9 and have disastrous consequences. But as we take a step back and we see the story of Gideon as a whole, Alan, we really see we see very much an art storyline that it begins in a bad place where the people are being punished for their idolatry, that they're unfaithful to the Lord. Chapter 6 and verse 1, they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Midian then shows up on the scene. The people cry out to the Lord. He delivers them. He comes to Gideon and identifies him as being the one through whom they would be delivered. He is hesitant. He is cowardly. He tests God on a number of occasions. And then he finally grows into someone who has confidence in God in the middle of in the middle of chapter 7. And yet it seems he very quickly allows that confidence to get to his own head, where he elevates him to be this royal figure beside the Lord in this battle cry. He then is upset because the Ephraimites took a trophy, in a sense, that he believed it belonged to him. He then takes that anger and that revenge out on his own people. He grows into this position of being a king of sorts, even though, again, tongue in cheek, he says that this isn't going to be the case. And so we have him in the beginning of the story doing what the Lord he has said, even though hesitantly. He tears down idols in his own backyard. He gets to a high place where he delivers the people, but then things go downhill, and he ends up he goes from being the person who broke down the idols to being the person who allows for idols to be resurrected again. And kind of the bridge between that is the own type of pagan worship that he engages in with the ephod that he established within his own town of Afra. It just shows again how, man, just how complicated the judges were. They were very complicated people. Their
Mm.
stories are very complicated. They have high moments, but then they have extremely low moments. And for Gideon himself, he is the microcosm of all the other judges, which is why more than likely he's positioned in the place that he is, where he is this middle figure within the story of the judges. As I bring back up this graphic, this visual from Kenneth Way, you just see the progression of the judges. He's right here in the middle, and he has his own prologue, and he really has his own epilogue, and they correspond very well with the entire prologue, entire epilogue of the story of the judges as a whole. And I believe, Alan, if I'm correct here, that this is the last time we read in the book of peace. It was the last time that we read it specifically stated that there was peace within the land within the days of one of the judges. From here on out, it is going to be struggle after struggle, and where there might have been some high points within the story of these original judges, those are going to become scarce, just as God was very much present in the beginning. In the first half of Gideon's story, he is very much absent for the most part in the second half of the story, and that really is the same thing that's going to be true for these judges as we continue throughout the story as is revealed to us here. Before we get into Abimelech on Tuesday, Alan, what do you have to conclude us concerning Gideon and his story?
I like to just think of all the, we mentioned how Gideon is kind of uh, a singular person, but I think he represents kind of the story of Israel as a whole. We've seen a lot of Exodus,
Mm-hmm.
Moses parallels, and it kind of makes sense once you kind of put all the pieces together. I mean, who was Gideon? Gideon was this youngest son. We read later that all of his older brothers had been killed by the Midianites. He's suffering at the hand of Midian, and he feels like he's been forgotten by God. Well, that was the Israelites in Egypt, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And for 400 years they cried out, and there was no answer from God. And then finally God comes and delivers them, and that's what we see a lot of these kind of Moses parallels. Moses was the one that God, the deliverer that God brought to them, and he's like, no, send someone else. He makes all these excuses and asks for signs just like Gideon does. And then Gideon uh, has this great victory, even though he's vastly outnumbered. And same thing, the Israelites have this great victory against Pharaoh's army, which the Israelites didn't have the victory. It was God brought this victory as they
Mm-hmm.
passed through the Red Sea. And then it seems like everything's great. And what did the Israelites do? They Exodus 32, they gather all these earrings and things. And Moses was up on the mountain for too long, so they decided that he must be dead. So let's start worshiping this idol that they formed. And this is the God that brought them out of the land of Egypt. And
Mm-hmm.
so you have the story of Israel in the story of Gideon. And how Gideon's story uh, does end with some peace. I mean, Israel finally gets some peace for a time in the land, but then that gets us to the days of the judges here. And I think that's where the Abimelech story comes in later on. You have just crazy wickedness, infighting, killing brothers. It gets real bad real quick in the
Yeah,
next
yeah.
chapter. And that's exactly what happens with the story of Israel. It seemed great in Joshua. Everything was okay. We were conquering the land, and then bam, Judges hits, and just there's just chaos and infighting and civil war and all sorts of craziness happening. So this Gideon Abimelech arc story is, I think, a real good parallel for the Israelites from Exodus 1 up until now.
Yeah, absolutely. And you think about it, all this being the negative story of Israel, and yet what this is pointing to eventually is going to be the positive story that Israel ought to have been, as is displayed in the life of Jesus. That many of the things that Israel suffered through, the persecution, the difficulty, the struggle, Jesus experienced those in his life, and yet instead of being unfaithful as Israel was, Jesus showed them what they should have been and what they could have been in the eyes of God. And that's certainly why he serves as our perfect example of what he expects of his people. He, just as Gideon could be the microcosm of the negative side of Israel, Jesus is a microcosm of the positive side of Israel. They are everything. He is everything Israel could have been and should have been, I should say. He is everything Israel should have been. And here is Gideon being everything that Israel could have been. And that just whenever we take a step back and we're able to look, and it's really what we're doing in this study, isn't it, Alan? We're trying to look big picture at the Bible. How do these individual stories, how do the individual books, how do they fit into the big picture of the biblical narrative? I hope that this study has been beneficial to everyone. If you maybe missed our first couple of studies on Gideon, I invite you to go back and check it out. Go back to last week's study. You have to scroll down a little bit in our video tab because we do post a great deal of content to Facebook and YouTube. But go back to that first study in Judges 6 and catch up to where we are today. And I hope that it gives you a better understanding of God's word, because we do believe that a better understanding, a better knowledge of God's word leads to a greater ability to trust him. And that greater ability to trust him leads to greater faith in who he is, what he has done, and what he expects of us. We certainly just want to grow in our knowledge of God and our faith in him, our trust in him through these studies. Alan, do you have anything else you want to finish this out with? Thank you so much. Great insight today, as always.
I was going to say, I just happened either yesterday or today. Maybe I think we were on our way to church, and I was kind of, I've been looking ahead, and I've been studying Ruth, which is the book that comes right after this. And at the beginning of Ruth, it says it takes place during the days of the judges. So you have this whole book of judges, and it's just, kind of negative characters. And then all of a sudden you have this one separate little book, 4 chapters about Ruth and Boaz. And it's like a breath of fresh air in terms of their moral character compared to what happens in this in this entire book. And I think there's a lot of parallels, like you mentioned, of Christ as well. All of these morally flawed characters just highlight the difference between Christ and them and Christ. Well, same thing here on a more limited scale with all these characters, and then this Ruth the Moabitess, who you know basically does everything right in her story that that we are read. Obviously not perfect like Christ, but we get some Christ-like figures, especially with Boaz in that story as well. So that's something to look forward to. There is a light at the end of this tunnel of this fatal funnel of wretched, putrid, chaos that's happening in Judges.
Right. We certainly appreciate the Lord's wisdom in helping for his scriptures to be organized in such a way through his providence that the horrid nature of Judges is followed up by something that is much more palatable in the story of Ruth and what takes place there. We certainly appreciate that. It's kind of like taking a nasty swig of medicine and following that up very quickly by something that really cleanses the palate. Ruth does that a bit for us, and we certainly are appreciative for it. Alan, thank you so much. Appreciate your insight as always, and I know that our audience does as well. Hope that you feel blessed by the study that we've had today. Thank you for the kind words of encouragement that we hear from time to time from those who do participate in this study, whether in the comment section, whenever you catch us at the church house or something. Thank you for those kind words. I know personally speaking, I have just benefited so greatly from this study. Being able to have a greater understanding of the narrative of scripture, how things work together, how things are progressing through the story has benefited me in a great way. And I hope that has benefited you as well. Thank you for participating and encouraging us in this work. Hope you have a great rest of your Friday. And if you're looking for a church to worship with on Sunday morning, I invite you to join us at 384 Pleasant Plains Road at 9 a.m. as we worship together. And if you're not able to be out for some various reason, I invite you to join us either here on Facebook or on YouTube, as we'll be streaming that assembly on Sunday. You're more than welcome to join us in that way as well. And if you maybe you're looking for some daily activity in God's Word apart from what we do here in Walking Through History on Tuesday and Fridays, join us on Mondays, Wednesday, and Friday, as well as we're doing some reading and reflecting within the Psalms. Those go live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 a.m., but they're there for you to take in whenever you're able to watch them, read through the Psalms with us, and think upon what is had within the Psalms. Our focus for this year is knowing God. And at the end of each of those reflections, we try to give a single point of what we know about God, what we can come to know about God in that text. I hope that's a blessing to you as well. And we've really enjoyed putting that content on Facebook and YouTube too. Certainly doing things a lot differently than we were a year ago. YouTube, Facebook wasn't a big emphasis in our work as a church, but it certainly is now in COVID world. And again, though we don't enjoy COVID world, though we wish COVID world did not exist, we look to find the blessings in the difficulty.
We make the best of it.
That's exactly right. We take some lemons and we make the best lemonade we can. Try to get that Chick-fil-A quality lemonade if we can. Uh, but thank you for joining us in those in these ways of studying with you. Hope they have been a blessing to you. Again, have a great rest of your Friday. Take care. Hope you'll join us next Tuesday. Here as we continue to walk through history, Judges chapter 9. We will read and talk about the story of Abimelech. Thank you so much. God bless and take care.